Hello, everyone. So now we get to the meat of the matter, right? So we'll be discussing very briefly, and then we'll discuss it like in more detail in our discussion seminar. Rousseau's second discourse, which is the discourse on the origin and foundations of inequality among men, right? And we already talked about, the question that was posed from the Académie de Dijon, which is what is the origin of inequality among men, and is it authorized by natural law, right? And Rousseau sort of proposes to answer this question. He does it at length and does not get the prize, but really writes a chef-d'oeuvre, which has. I mean, we're reading it much later, as you can see, 2021 now, so many years later. Don't ask me to do the maths. So yeah, so we'll be looking at the origin of inequality among men and whether it is authorized by the natural law, according to Rousseau, right? So there are a few things out here, and I'll take many of these questions, many of these points one by one, and we'll discuss them, and then we'll discuss them more when we are all together, and I'm not just talking to myself and to the screen. Um, so the question is of origin. There's a question of foundation, which he has added, so there's this, and we'll see why two different things. Then there's a question of natural law, there's a question of nature, and there's a question of law, right? And a question of natural law as well. In relation to the problem of inequality, where does inequality come from? What does it have to do with nature? Yeah. And in our very first videos, so we discussed the natural law philosophers who were talking about the nature of man, right? And they were all looking for, this was also a time in which they were trying to find origins of things, origin of current institutions, and also to look for how did we arrive at this state of society that we're in. And we're looking at, at that time, 1600s, for example, with Hobbes or Locke, or now I've shared a text with you, Althusser's lectures. I've shared two of his. One is on the social contract, which is beautiful, and the other one is, lecture that he gave on the text that we're reading actually. And there he brings up this question of origin, right? And what is Rousseau doing, which is different from the rest of the philosophers? And he brings up this very important point that. Rousseau is actually trying to understand origin also in its concept, like not just sort of to find origin, which was very fashionable at that time, but to also understand what can origin even mean, and how do we get there, and to critique it in his own writing. Because one of the problems, as he points out, and which I'm sure you all also rightly see, is that when we talk about origin from our current time, we are perhaps just putting our current notions back. So when Hobbes says that human beings are like intrepid and competitive, and they're constantly, like they like backstab each other as soon as they get the chance. Now, where is he getting this notion from? And Rousseau actually does criticize him, saying that you are saying all these things about human beings, but you're just basically putting ideas of what humans are like after they have been corrupted by society, and then sort of retrospectively placing it in this idea of the original humans. And so basically you're always going to be right, because your um, origins are decided, your idea of origin, of foundation, is decided on the basis of what you already have. So you're basically trying to give justifications for the state that you're in right now. And Bruce also does that to a bit, but he is more conscious of it. And so we'll see, how, I mean, we'll obviously have this discussion in class as well, but we'll see, where he takes it and how he deals with the question of origin. So before that, let's sort of first look at the question of nature, the state of nature. Oh, sorry, this text has become really tiny, but I suppose I can try and read it. So I know, like, one of the things that people, especially when we had our first discussion, I asked you, what do you know about Rousseau? And I think one or two of you said, well, the idea of the noble savage, the idea of the state of nature being great. And actually, these are all romantic notions that come from what I think is a fundamental misreading of Rousseau. Of course, there are some elements of this there in Rousseau already, but because of the already Europeans going around the world and discovering different sort of cultures, and then calling them savages, which is so offensive. Well, of course, but anyway. So there is some element of that influence is there, but Rousseau is doing something fairly different, yeah, from what the popular conception of this is. So in this, Rousseau's sort of epigraph is from Aristotle, in which he writes, "Non in depravate sed in his quae bene secundum naturam se habent, considerandum est quid fit naturale." Right? Basically, translates to, it is not in the depraved. So what is natural has to be investigated, not in those that are depraved, but in those that are good according to nature. And this idea of depravity becomes really important, right? So what's wrong with human beings right now, as far as Rousseau is concerned, is this depravity that he is quoting from this Latin translation of Aristotle. And so he says that, when we're looking for human nature, why are we looking at the ones who have already been denatured, right? Those who have gone through this, gone into the state of depravity, which means that um, they're not natural anymore anyway. So let's find, those that are good according to nature, right? And so this idea of, and we'll talk about this idea of good as well, because this good is not exactly the idea of morally good or virtuous. So again, there's a different thing that Rousseau is doing. But what he's doing here is, so he says, let's set aside all the facts, right? So he's building this hypothesis, this elaborate hypothesis about this idea of what the original state of nature was. um, he says, without sort of recourse to theology or physics, and to search for this uncorrupted human in that. Yeah. So basically a turn to fiction. So we'll come back to that, but let's sort of first look at the idea of the the good person who is not depraved yet, who is still in nature, of nature, right? So a natural being, a naturally good sort of human being. So um, this is the idea of le bon sauvage, the good savage, right? Which was later picked up by the Romantics. But what is Rousseau talking about when he says that this person is naturally good? What is a naturally good man? A naturally good man is somebody who is, in a very strict sense, innocent, right? Who has not been harmed as yet by society, innocent, right? Has not been hurt, harmed by things. So is without disguise, is without appearances, is in its sort of like denuded form, let's say, uh, i.e. not yet corrupted, right? So this is what the sort of naturally good person is. But then what kind of a person is this person? This person is neither good nor evil, right? In fact, this person is really neutral, because we can only describe this person negatively, right? Has not been corrupted, has not been harmed, has not been denatured, has not been depraved. So and has not put on appearances and disguises. So is a kind of a neutral person, right? Who is um, neither good nor evil. We'll see is also outside of history, is ahistorical, really. Does not have any past or future. Why? Because does not have any memory of what has happened before, does not have any forethought of like what might happen after, due to the current things that he is doing, right? And his only instinct really is self-preservation, wants to preserve himself, itself, herself, in that situation, without suffering what Rousseau calls the fears of pain and hunger. So the main fear that this person also has is pain and hunger. And in fact, Rousseau says that this person will not even fear death, because that requires some kind of memory and forethought. but pain and hunger are sort of immediate things. I'm hungry right now, so I'll suffer that, and then I know what to do about it. So I have that much instinct of self-preservation, so I'll know, okay, that fruit might relieve my hunger. I am in pain, so maybe I can do something, or I could just moan and whine or whatever, right? So I'm suffering that right then. So these are immediate sort of sufferings, immediate miseries, which as soon as elevated, I'm happy again, right? So this is the idea of this bon sauvage. Yeah. uh, this person has nevertheless a maxim, as Rousseau puts it. Not a conscious maxim. He's not like, okay, I'm following this rule of law which I have been given by God, and whatever, Rousseau. So this is a maxim of natural goodness, as Rousseau calls it, which basically says, do your good with the least possible harm to others. And the good for this person is basically self-preservation, right? So preserve yourself as much as possible, uh, without, so long as you don't harm another person. Like, if it is necessary to harm another person for self-preservation, then self-preservation would win, right? So there is no virtue there that I will suffer so that the other person doesn't suffer. Rather, I will take care of myself and try and survive as much as possible, and I'll try not to harm other people. But if they get in my way, then I can't do anything about it. So it's different from Hobbes, because with Hobbes, the natural human will go out of their way to harm others for their profit. And Rousseau is saying this is absolute nonsense, because these ideas are not even there at that time. Yeah. So this maxim, Rousseau says, is what ensures the mutual preservation of the entire species, right? Because otherwise the species would not have survived. And I think that's what Hobbes also says, that like, the human life would be very short and unkind. I mean, for five adjectives out there, but yeah, not a very great life. So what Rousseau is saying is that no, that's not what's going to what must have happened. Let's say in the state of nature, where people must have had this kind of a maxim of natural goodness, in which they don't want to see their own kind suffer, right? So they feel this feeling of pity, right? An innate repugnance to seeing their own kind suffer. Like you see another being suffering, of your kind, and you feel, oh no, this is too painful. And in fact, perhaps there is some level of an imaginary sort of identification with the other that happens, this immediate imaginary identification, saying, oh yeah, this person is suffering. So like, and this is something that is part of the animal nature of humans, according to Rousseau, if we can use that term. This innate repugnance to see their own kind suffer. Yep. So what he says then is that now this being is in some ways happy, innocent. Like, if we are thinking of like a very basic happiness, because this happiness is just sort of an absence of pain and hunger. So it is not really, it's just an aponia, as or perhaps a bit of an ataraxia as well. There's tranquility, but not quite. If they suffer pain and hunger, then like, it's a pre it's a happiness without the notion of happiness there, that this kind of a creature would have, right? And given that this creature, this person, uh, does not have any kind of past or future, they just live in the moment. They live in the moment, they suffer in the moment, and once that moment is gone, that moment is gone. There's no memory per se. So there cannot be any progress in this state. Yeah. Because there are no human relations to sustain. So let's say in my life, I mean, I'm still a human being, so maybe I developed a few skills. So I developed a few skills of of a few tools to help me. And maybe I even discovered fire, that keeps me warm, when I'm cold in winter. And but in this state of nature, again, this is one thing that Rousseau says, that people don't sort of gather together. They're all dispersed in different places, so they don't gather together. And as they do not gather together, they don't have any connection. There are no human relations, right? And so how will the knowledge be transferred? They might meet once in a while, perhaps, to have sex and have babies, or maybe not even with that plan, it just happens. And then they separate again. The child separates from the mother, soon enough, as soon as they grow up. Like, I think he's looking at, some animal sort of like relations to decide, to imagine this kind of a life for humans. Um, and so he says that, he says the art perished with the inventor. There was neither education nor progress. Generations multiplied uselessly. And as each one of them always started at the same point, centuries went by. In all the crudeness of the first ages, the species had already grown old and man remained ever a child, right? So you're starting over and over again. You're at every stage, you're like still at the same stage, so you get through the whole thing and then you start ab initio again with like every new human, because there is no society to transfer the knowledge, so memory, as far as Rousseau is concerned, is a collective thing. It's not an individual thing. So if there is no collective, if there's no group of people together, then I mean, how will there be anything to like hand over? There'd be no tradition. Tradition is tra. It's the idea of handing over. Let's put it right. Trado, right? So I hand over. Uh, Now there is nothing to hand over because there is nobody else around you, right? You live alone, you die alone. You might encounter a few people once in a while, like animals encounter each other, but then they go away, right? So that's why there's no progress in this state, right? So then there comes a problem. What is a problem? And this is I think the most interesting part of Rousseau, is a problem of transition. So how is it, and now he's imagining, as he said, this is a fiction he's creating. It's a fiction of what might have been, the original state of human beings, looking at other animals, I think, right? And he says, well, it is impossible to conceive how man could, by his own strength alone, without the help of communication and without the good of necessity, have crossed so great a divide. Right, and in fact, there's another essay that I'll share with you if you want, which is essay on the origin of language, where he talks about, where could language have come from? Like originally there was no need for language. At most you might need some cry of warning or something, but or cry of pain or misery, but you would not have a sustained language with all its grammatical structures and all these. Where did that come from? How did we even create it? And it's the same question of transition. How do you go from, like, a savage animal in that sense, crying and like making certain sounds, eating, living in the moment, to this complex, elaborate structure of society with a very complicated language and like all kinds of structures and hierarchies? How do we go there? So how did we get from this imagined fictional state that he's talking about to this hierarchical complex structure that we have around us? So this is how he reframes the question. Remember the question: what is the origin of inequality and whether it is authorized by natural law? Now he has given us an idea of what is nature. What is the nature of man, right? And this nature of man, from here, how do we get to the current society as it is, right? So the idea of transition. Now, before we go there, this very interesting question, and we'll discuss this more because, this video cannot be too long. I'm still watching the time, so I've already talked for 20 minutes, and this means that I'm really running out of time. But we'll talk about the idea of, the history and fiction. So this is something that, I'm just going to go through the slide very quickly so that, but I want you to keep it in mind. When we talk about origin, we always talk about this problem of infinite regress, right? You're going backwards, and this infinite regress, philosophers have often sort of resolved by the idea of a, a causa sui. It is supposed to be causa sui. Autocorrect changed it to cause sui. I don't know why, I hate autocorrect. Anyway, the idea of a causa sui, which is, a cause of itself, a reason for itself, which is an origin of itself, right? Because if otherwise, if you try to think about origin, so what is the origin? What is the origin of the origin? What is the origin of the origin of the origin of the origin of the, and you'll go into infinite regress, right? So to strictly talk about origin, you have to talk about a first origin. And this first origin cannot have an origin. And that the only way you can have that if the origin is the origin of itself. In mathematics, it's the idea of a foundational set, right? Anyway, this is an absolute origin, which would be often enough God, right? So people would, this is where philosophers would have recourse to God. Otherwise gods don't play that much of a role really necessarily in most philosophers, amongst most philosophers. But like when they find these gaps where they have to fill things up, so this is one of the big gaps. So where did everything come from? Yeah, it came from the one state previous, and the one state previous came from the one state previous. And but with, where did it come from in the very beginning? And then like, oh, maybe God. All right, right. So this is, in fact, this is what we would call a turn to fiction, right? Because at the point where the real fails to hold in that sense, then you turn towards, and this is what Rousseau is also doing. He says, I'm not taking any recourse to physics or theology, because both when we look at the science of nature, like it's like, okay, so where did it originally come from? And I think Kant actually talks about it in his Critique of Pure Reason when he talks about the antinomies. And he gives these two sort of ideas of like it has always already existed, so like space and time are eternal, or there's space and time have like and things have a beginning in space and time. And then there's another one where he talks about infinite divisibility, and everything starts from atoms. So he sort of puts them all out of, like, he says basically people have spent too much time talking about this, let's just skip it now. That's Kant's solution to it, is to not talk about things, which I am not very fond of. But anyway, so Rousseau's solution I find a bit more fascinating, where he says, well, people come up with fictions, I'll come up with a fiction, but instead of coming up with the fiction of a god, I will come up with the fiction of a state of nature, right? So the one we just talked about. uh, so the question that he's asking is that before society corrupted him, because remember we are talking about this depraved person, denatured person, before society corrupted him, what was man? So the kind of fiction that he comes up with is both this kind of ahistoric fiction, right? Man outside of history, where he's talking about this idea of an imaginary man outside the movement of history, what he could have been in that state, right? The one we just talked about. And but it's also, and the problem, that is the issue here, right? The problem of transition, it's also a prehistoric man, because the question is about um, what is it that precedes and determines the entry of man in history, right? So at what point, he says, man could, by his own strength alone, without the help of communication and without the code of necessity, have crossed the divide to be outside of history to entering history, right? So this is one of the issues of transition that he's talking about. So we're looking at these two problems. In one way, we are looking at the problem of chronology, in which we are trying to understand the idea of how do we move from fiction to reality, right? So how do we move from this fictional state of nature to the real society that we have around us? And how do we also move from reality to fiction, which is what we are putting in here, that we're looking at society around us from here. Can we, without inconsistency, uh, assume the hypothesis that Rousseau is assuming, right? Like in this literary text itself, in this philosophical text itself, can we go from, so this is the formation of theory, really, in some ways, from this society. Can we, coherently and without, and in a way that is convincing, really, retroactively imagine the state of nature that Rousseau is coming up with? So this is something we can discuss in class. Right. And what I found extremely interesting, and the thing that is interesting, is this question of transition, as we have said, which is the dialectic of transition. And I'm calling it dialectic with, the three rules of dialectic that I think Engels, or one of those people, one of the Marxists, maybe it was Engels, he gave this very reductive three rules, and one of them was when quantity turns into quality. right? What is this quantity turns into quality is basically what we will call a qualitative leap, in which things are evolving slowly, and we'll see what evolution with for Rousseau looks like as well, in a minute. But things are evolving slowly and tending towards a new state, and at some point, but the point is that you can't see that evolution because things are too slow. So as he says in the previous one, he says, centuries went by, the species had grown old, man remained ever a child. There is no progress, nobody's growing old. You're still in that same state, or so it seems. But what we see now is that things are absolutely different from, how do we go from that cry, like it's like, the original cry of the humans, or of the animal, or the baby, if you want to think of it in like, immediate terms, to a full-fledged language with this complex grammatical structure, like, and how do you go from, this solitude, this original solitude when you were born, to this complex relational structure that we all find ourselves in, right? So we have already completed the transition, but now, having completed the transition, to look back and try to reconstruct it, we sort of get lost in this infinite regress, and that's what is happening because there's a gap that opens. And in fact, that's why I would say, the text by Althusser is very good, because he talks about décalage, these gaps, and what we have in Rousseau, and what I find especially interesting in Rousseau, are these quantitative leaps that the qualitative leaps that he makes at different points. They are really amazing, actually. The act by which a people is a people, the act by which by which civil society is formed. So there are always these acts, right? These moments of action which seem like things but tending towards it but never getting there, and then suddenly you're there, right? So you're this sort of like this eternal tangent which is tending towards it. There's the asymptote, and then you're on the other side, right? So this leap is really amazing. And this leap of faith, actually, you will see in Kierkegaard, so whom we are also going to read at some point. Becomes very important, and with Marx, of course. So yeah, anyway, let's not go into that. So yeah, so this question, I think, is very important, so we'll discuss that in our thing. As I said, we're almost 25 minutes, so let's sort of move on, right? So now the question is that of the origin of inequality, right? So the question that Rousseau asks is, what could be the chains of dependence among men who possess nothing, right? Now this is the most difficult question, right? Now, why, you don't own anything, you don't even spend enough thought on anything to own anything, right? You're hungry, you get food, blah blah blah, right? So why would you have any chains of dependence? And if you don't have any chains of dependence, then you won't have this kind of a relational structure which will cause inequality to sort of be born, like be there, right? So this is something that is required as far as Rousseau is concerned. So he gives the answer, part 2 of the text that you're reading, where he says, the first man who, having enclosed a piece of ground, to whom it occurred to say, this is mine, and found people sufficiently simple to believe him, was a true founder of civil society. And by civil society, we mean unequal civil society, right? So uncivil society. And so chains of dependence were created. So that he asks this question and he answers it, right? So he says, you possess nothing, you don't have any chains, right? The first time you possess something, and of course it's not, this is again, a fictional structure. So it's not, he's not saying that, there's one man somewhere who said, this is mine. And, like, it's like, God said, let there be light, and then there's light. No, it's not that. That's not what he's talking about. What he's saying is that the point where property, the act point, whatever, where property was instituted, is the beginning of inequality, because as soon as people start possessing things, as soon as you have private property is the cause of inequality. Very profound point, which, I think the Marxists really bring forward, like in the most impressive way, is the frustration of private property is the fall of innocence, as Rousseau would think of it, and what happens? Very sort of, this sort of like Paradise Lost kind of an image, where he says the fruits are everyone's and the earth's no one's. This is what they forget. So this is my fruit, not everybody's fruit, right? And and that's why they couldn't enjoy the bounty of nature anymore, because they cut off pieces and they said, you guys, you cannot use my tree. That's my tree. You can't take fruits from my tree, right? And this first act separated humans from animals, and at this point, inequality was sort of instituted as far as Rousseau is concerned, right? Yeah, I think I've repeated this point again, right? So let me see. Yeah, so before that, there were neither masters nor slaves, all these things. Right. So with this origin, now, before we go to the further institutional inequality, there was one thing that I wanted to bring up, is the question of why would this happen? Right, because this is a question that he had asked earlier, saying, like without communication, without necessity, how would you cross this divide? Where did this, how did it occur to somebody to say this piece of land is mine, right? So what Rousseau is saying is that he's trying to make a distinction between humans and animals. And this is something that philosophers have always tried to do, right? So with Aristotle, for example, when he said, okay, let's define, what is a human being? So he says, well, man is a rational animal, right? So it's a genus animal, man is an animal, but the species is decided by the differentia, which makes him rational, right? There are lots of other there are lots of other sort of characteristics that humans have. So so humans, laugh, they sing, there are all kinds of things. But there's one thing that constitutes the essence of this human, and that's what Aristotle would say is rationality. Now, Rousseau is also trying to answer this question, and he answers it by saying, well, actually, what distinguishes humans and animals are these two faculties, really. One is, and they're two interrelated faculties. One is the faculty of freedom, which the way he describes it is the power of willing, or rather that of choosing, in which he says, nature commands every animal, right, including man, and the beast obeys, right? So the animal obeys. Man experiences the same impression. So man also gets the same command, right? But he recognizes himself free to acquiesce or to resist, right? So human beings have a choice. Like, so there are instincts, let's say, right? Nature is, there are natural laws. Nature tries to command everybody and say, you fit in there, you do this, you eat this, you don't eat this, right? And all animals obey the command immediately, right? No questions. But human beings have a choice of either obeying or disobeying, which means that basically he's saying that human beings are not determined by nature, right? Which is different from, for example, Baron de Holbach and that determinist camp. So basically he's saying human beings are not determined by nature, and not determined by nature, they have a choice. So basically, think about it. So if, let's say, you are a herbivorous animal, and I place meat in front of you, or if you are a carnivorous animal and I place grains in front of you, you will starve. You will not eat what nature has prescribed that you should not eat, as Rousseau would think of it, right? But as humans, you know, you may not, like, in fact, there might be things that are really harmful for you, yeah, which you should not be eating, but you nevertheless will, right? I mean, if you want to. So this will that comes in the middle is what is the problem, as far as Rousseau is concerned. Yeah, is what distinguishes humans from animals. So that's one. And the other, related to this, is what he calls the faculty of perfecting oneself, right? Which he says is a faculty which, with the aid of circumstances, successively develops all the others and resides in us, in the species as well as in the individual. What is this? What is this faculty? So basically, human beings are conscious of their imperfection, right? Animals do not think that much. They're like, okay, as we are perfect. Or in fact, they don't even think that, like nature commands, they obey, right? While human beings have this consciousness really of, I could do better, I could be different, I have a choice, right? So it's not just, having a choice, but also having consciousness of that choice. And that consciousness of the choice comes from imperfection. In fact, this is probably an answer to the sort of Platonic Socratic sort of notion of human beings would always choose the best possible solution. Like any wrong that is done comes from ignorance. So if you're not ignorant, you will choose the best, right? So the choice of the because if you know what is best, you will choose it. But what Rousseau is saying is, well, you know you know that there is something lacking, and then you're given a choice, and even if you know what is best, you may or may not choose it. Yeah. So basically, his question is, why is man alone liable to become imbecile, right? The other animals continue as they are. They were the same in the beginning, and they continue the same, and they die, right? So there is no difference. While human beings can get worse, right? They don't necessarily get better. And as far as Rousseau is very pessimistic about human nature, so he says that people are getting worse, right? So why? So he says it's because they're not led by instinct, but they have the freedom to choose. And when they choose, they can often choose what is bad, what is worse. They don't necessarily choose the best option of two options given to them, right? So let's say they have like they should not be eating meat, and they have been given the choice of meat and vegetables. They might still decide, oh no, I'm not going to have those vegetables, I'll have meat, right? So or like some other example, without prejudice. But anyway, so the idea is that human beings, in that sense, can be depraved because they can denature themselves, right? So they can choose for survival, because remember, that was already there, even in the like. So that's something that nature hardwired into us in some ways, as this instinct for self-preservation, or so we thought. But what we realize now is that even that instinct we can get over. There's no instinct that is, in that sense, completely hardwired, because we can get over it, right? And act in such a way which goes against our self-preservation. So in that sense, we are denatured, right? So for survival, or even for a whim, right? I mean, I don't need to eat that ice cream, but or it's not even good for me. I have like a really bad cold and I've been coughing, but yeah, I see it and I'm like, I'm going to have that ice cream, right? So that means that unlike animals who are determined by nature, we are determined by our will, right? By what we want. And in that sense, we are susceptible, let's say, to perfectibility, right? We are conscious of our imperfection. We are conscious, we're capable. We're conscious that we're capable of changing ourselves. And this is what he would call the condition of possibility for progress. And progress, as far as Rousseau is concerned, is the same as corruption, right? So this is a condition of possibility for progress, and this is how we are corrupted. Yeah. Okay, so yeah, let me just drink some water. Great. So now we are looking at, so I already talked about the quantitative leap that we were talking about. So how does the notion of perfectibility relate to the notion of quantitative leap? Right. So remember, perfectibility we just talked about as the condition of possibility really of progress or corruption. So perfectibility itself is a kind of progress or corruption. So you see, you have a faculty of making yourself better. That means that there is something lacking. There's a gap that can be filled, and when you try to fill it, you progress, but you also denature yourself, and so you're corrupted. Right. So he says, This distinctive and almost unlimited faculty is the source of all of man's miseries, which by dint of time draws him out of that original condition in which he would spend tranquil and innocent days, and which, over the centuries, causing him his enlightenment and his errors, his vices and his virtues to bloom, eventually makes him his own and nature's tyrant. Yeah. So this perfectibility is the cause of misery, right? So, but and of progress, of course. But is it enough? Like just that we have a consciousness of our imperfection and we can improve. But remember, when we talked about this, the state of nature, remember the art perished with the inventor. So we, for perfectibility, let's say we develop tools. I might have, discovered fire, all kinds of things to make my life easier. So I improve things, but it got lost, right? And generations went by and nothing changed, right? So there is quantitative change, but at what point will it get to qualitative change? At what point would there be a leap, and this leap which would lead to the origin of civil society, right? Of saying this piece of land is mine. So basically he says, sorry, yeah, he says that right, the social virtues and other faculties which natural man had received in potentiality could never develop in themselves, and that in order to do so, they needed the fortuitous concatenation of several foreign causes which might never have arisen, and without which he would forever have remained in his primitive condition. So what do we require, right? So here, what we require is for a number of accidents which would come together to create this, and it is accidents, so that's why it is so difficult in some ways, like one of the hypotheses for why it is so difficult to imagine this transition is because we cannot imagine what exact concatenation of chance circumstances got together to for people to make that leap, right? This gap between quantitative change, which is forever progressing and never reaching anywhere, to the qualitative leap, right, is dependent on some sufficient condition, right? You have all kinds of necessary conditions, but so long as you don't have you don't have sufficient condition, things are not going to jump, right? So that's what is required. Is this um, well, Althusser really talks about it later as overdetermination, right? But like he says that in fact it's not just determination, you need to have it overdetermined, you need to have more things than necessary. In fact, he gets that idea from Freud, whom we'll also be reading, where you have this idea of things need to be overdetermined, concatenation of several foreign causes which may never have arisen. These are all chance things, and if they hadn't arisen, then things would have not changed and we would have been in the same state. But we cannot recreate that experiment again. So that experiment was created by chance, by randomness, and by a chance that we are not able to reimagine. Like it's like the question of how did life arise in the first place? This is something that bothers people, has been bothering people for like since the earliest texts that we have, is the spontaneous generation of life. So what circumstances could have gotten together to create this? And this is something, and then again, it's again the problem of origin and of transition, to go back to the origin, but also to understand progressively, how it can go from the previous state to the next state. Yeah. So, I mean, my hypothesis, and this last line is mine, is that it is quite possible that, on the one hand, it is the faculty of perfectibility, which is pushing, right? So there is a continuous change that is happening. But, there is also the idea of the act, right? This idea of these concatenation of foreign causes or something inside causes, something that turns up that causes this change, that an insurrection, really, a change that cannot be stopped. And so in that sense, change, to think of change, we have to think of it in both as both something that is continuous, but also something that is a leap, right? A momentous change, a jump. So yeah, so this is what I was trying to sort of, get at with this. But yeah, let's continue. So I like, oof, we are like really running out of time. Okay, so now that now that we have talked about the origin in that sense, right? This act by which inequality was instituted, which he says is by the first creation of private property, really, right? So first person saying this land is mine and forgetting that the fruits are everyone's and the earth no one's. What happened next? So he says, the next, now that this event has arisen, now there's a first basic need for association, right? Why do we have this basic need of association? To protect your goods, because you alone are not going to be able to watch your tree all the time. You said that that tree is mine, but you need to, like you go away somewhere else for a bit and then somebody else has stolen all your fruits. So you need to protect these goods. And so he says, was the first institution of family. And this first institution of family is what instituted the first difference in the ways of the living of the two sexes. So at this point, we realize that what he was talking about earlier was, in the state of nature, there was no difference. There was no difference between man and woman. There was no sexual difference. So sexual difference is established by the institution of property, right? And this was the first step. And then this led, and after that, you, like, let's say you had babies or, whatever, or even if you did not, you the expansion of property, required by the increase in the numbers would lead to either you capturing more trees, but that might not be enough, or developing something else. And remember, the faculty of perfectibility always has, leaves us with the possibility of experimenting, right, of trying new things. And so he says, as soon as it was found to be useful for one to have provisions for two, and two for three, and three for four, it led to the development of metallurgy and agriculture. And it's there in the text. We'll discuss it, in class as well. And this made work necessary, like, because you want to do agriculture, which means you need to work. Before this, you were not working, you were lounging about, eating fruits, and then lounging about. That's, well, at least that's Rousseau's imagination. Now it is necessary to work, and work means slavery. I mean, work is slavery, right? So work is slavery, work is misery, all these things. And so that's what Rousseau says. Slavery and misery were soon seen to spout and grow together with the harvest, right? So now everything is like you're slaves just to the harvest, but you are, right? You have to work. And that is the definition of slavery, is that you can't escape work, as far as, I mean, this is a very basic definition. Of course, there are much more complicated historical definitions that we're not going into right now, though Rousseau will bring that up as well, right? And so this then and because of this, then there was a division of land and property. Now, once you have a division of land and property, and you want to say that this piece of land is mine, and just that fence around is not enough, and you get fence, and then you get dogs, and then you get like a big family to protect it. So then you need, some rules of division, of like, this piece of land is mine, that is not mine, all these things. And so this sort of division would lead to what he says. I mean, this justice per se is not something that led to a better world, really. It led to, like, giving the title of right, as he says, to this unequal appropriation of resources. Because let's say I managed to capture this one piece of land, and another, and then there was this just one last piece of, like, sand left somewhere, and the last person just has that, and so they don't have any fruits. And that means that they will need to work for somebody else, and join somebody else's group, because they can't by themselves manage to survive, right? But they can also, in a Hobbesian sense, go and try and steal it, stab that person in the back and try and get it. Then, but what happens then is the others would want some kind of a law, right? So then they managed to found this laws, these rules of justice, which the first rules came for inequality, to make right this unequal distribution of property. Yep. And so this is the end really of of equality. So this is nascent society. This is the end of like the original independence that people had, and because then people will start getting new needs that intensify over time, as he says, and the need for other human beings also to protect your property or to just survive, depending on which side you're on. And so he says, um, this nascent society then gave rise to the state of war, right? The first state of war, where the most powerful or the most miserable claimed on the basis of their strength or of their needs a kind of right to another person's goods, in which everybody is against everybody else, a situation that he says armed all of them against one another. So the Hobbesian state of nature, where Hobbes says this is where we start, Rousseau is like, no, 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 this is not where we start, this is where we end. Right, this is where we get to because of the institution of private property, right? So he says, um, and this situation, as like, is obviously precarious, as anybody can imagine. And then they institute laws. So earlier there was this right, and this right now becomes law, right? Because otherwise it would have all fallen into disorder, and people, it would be the Hobbesian state of nature, like miserable short. So these laws were brought in to bring peace, right? But he says this peace is not really peace, right? It's, first of all, it's servitude, because what does it do? The ones who are weak, ones who don't have their big property, they have new chains, new fetters. The rich have new powers, new forces, and that means that your inequality has become entrenched now, right? Because now the gap is going to increase. The poor are going to become poorer, the weak are going to become weaker, and the strong and the powerful are going to get richer and more powerful, right? And law is always on the side of the more powerful and the more rich, right? So the law will be on side of profit, on side of who is more ambitious and more powerful and more clever in that sense, and who can subjugate the other person to what he says, labor, servitude, and misery, right? So this is what law is for. Law is basically an institutionalization of inequality. And then he says also this peace is not really peace, because you would have maybe peace in that one particular area, supposed peace, by instituting inequality and dividing people into master and slave, and then making some people work for others. But then many such societies will spring up, right? Why would just one society spring up? Even originally many such people might have said that this piece of land is mine, right? It's not just one person who then worked as an example for others. That's not what Rousseau is saying. And so once many such societies spring up, they'll fight with each other. And so either they need to imitate the other and they become like enemies for each other, or they get swallowed by the other and then they become part of the other, and so you have empires then that start growing, which eventually, not yet. And so you'll have a general state of war, as he calls it, right? Which is a general state of war between all these societies. And he says that it's not actual war, but a steady, considered, and manifest will to destroy one's enemy, merely waiting for the opportune moment, right? And this is where we will end up with inequality, right? Now, this is civil society, right? So earlier we had this nascent society, then we got into the state of war. Now we have civil society. Now each civil society now wants to maintain internal peace, right? And fight with other such groups, right? So Rousseau says that they also go through stages. So just like the state of nature, so earlier we had the state of nature, this is also a state of nature, except not the original good state of nature, but the corrupted state of nature. So it got to civil society in 3 stages. Now this civil society itself goes through different stages, in which it goes through a kind of elective meritocracy, in which people are elected by merit, who is the best. Then the ones who get power through that, then establish themselves and what he calls, a factional gerontocracy arises. So they form factions and intrigues, and they try to hold on to power even when they stop having merit, and when there are other people who might be more meritorious, but they don't let them come forward, and then they try to hold on to power for as long as possible till whatever age. And then they start establishing a kind of hereditary aristocracy. So they say, no, no, it's my own child. So even when they're dying, they're like, no, it's my child, it's my nephew, it's my, the person I appoint who is going to be next to rule, right? And that is basically the end, right? Final stage of nature. This is civil society, right? And why do we have these transitions is basically because people start forming factions, intrigues, and these intrigues inside society, inside each one, lead to this perpetual internal state of war. So there's an external state of war going on between societies, but even within, there's a perpetual state of war going on. And what happens then is that the hereditary system gets so established that he says people start calling their fellow citizens their slaves and calling themselves equals to the gods and kings of kings. So you have masters and slaves. So the final stage, to summarize, what happens there. So first there was the institution of property, remember, first stage, which led to the distinction between the rich and the poor. Then you had the institution of elective government, which led to the distinction between the separation between the powerful and weak, which obviously happened earlier as well, but this became entrenched. And then finally, uh, there was institution of hereditary government, which led to the division of society between master and slave, which he calls the last degree of inequality, right? Which he says is necessarily a state of war. There's internal war and there's external war everywhere. Yeah. And so now that we have reached this final stage, what kind of inequality do we have? We have a state in which you have masters and slave, which will be in perpetual, state of war, because nobody will choose slavery, right? Nobody says, oh, I want to be a slave. Yeah. I would prefer to be a slave. Masters and slaves cannot exist except in opposition, as he says, right? So a choice of servitude, and in fact, we can read this text by Laboissy called Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, amazing text. But yeah, anyway, the choice of servitude, he says, is an act of necessity, not of will. I don't choose, like, even though he talked earlier about perfectibility and will, but like now we have compelled ourselves, we have put ourselves in such a state that now we are being compelled, not by nature, but by society. So this is the state of corruption that we have reached, in which we are forced into slavery. Yep. And uh, this slavery is institutionalized in law, and this law is this kind of a what he calls an illegitimate and absurd convention. And it's illegitimate and absurd. Why? Because it says that I make a convention with you, I make a contract with you, in which, and this is a contract between a master and a slave. What kind of a contract is it? He says, which is entirely at your expense and entirely to my profit, which I shall observe as long as I please, and which you shall observe as long as I please. Right? So the master has all the rights, he has everything. It's not a contract. It cannot be a contract, because a contract needs to have some give and take, right? Here I'm saying, I'll take all profit from you, I will have all rights over you, I'll observe this as long as I want, you'll observe this as long as I want, you'll do whatever I want. So it's an absurd contract, he says. So he asks this question. He says, do the subjects then give their persons on the condition that their goods will be taken as well? Right? I give you my person, and anything that I have, that too you can take. Anything I make, that too you can take. Right? So he says, I do not see what they have left to preserve. He says that he cannot see the logic to this slavery, right? So, but he says that that's where we are at, right? The final state, the state that lies at the end of this progress, this progressive chain of inequality, is this state, right? And he says that until new revolutions dissolve this, and bring it closer to legitimate institution, and we'll talk about what that legitimate institution could be, he says this is where we are, right? So this is the final stage of inequality that we have gotten to. Now, the question that we can ask is that, can we have a return to nature? Can we go back? Right? It sounded good, like after looking at this horrible state, where now we have no freedom even. Can we return to nature? Rousseau is like, not quite, paradise lost. You have been kicked out of paradise. You're not going back there. Yeah. So And in fact, you don't want to go back there because you have lost your innocence. Your peace and innocence are lost. So, and they're lost before you tasted their delights. So you never had paradise in the first place, is what he's saying. Maybe somebody lost paradise generations ago, but we did not have it. We have been brought up in this corrupted world. And one of the fundamental flaws of the state of nature was that there was a lack of connectedness. This innocence also meant that we were extremely stupid, right? Didn't have a past, future, memory, good, bad, anything, virtues or vices, so it was very uninteresting people. So in fact, if you've read Milton's Paradise Lost, I don't know, Adam and Eve like are, yeah, I mean, so he says that, and that means that our understanding could not develop. We would live without sensing anything. We would die without having lived. Our entire happiness would consist in not knowing misery, right? There'd be neither goodness in our hearts nor morality in our actions. So we don't want paradise, right? We don't want to return to nature because this is not exactly the kind of world we would want, right? And so, and this lack of connectedness also would make public good impossible. So now if I decide to go back to nature, it can only be an individual thing, like one person escapes, but that too is not going to be possible, right? So like this kind of a freedom from society is like, it's senseless. And which is why I think Rousseau would be a very good critic of the romantics, the romantic idea of like going back to nature, escaping from the corruptions of society and the world. He's like, "Pup, pup, nonsense," right? So he says we would have never tasted the most delicious sentiment of the soul, which is a love of virtue, right? We'll be really boring, really terrible, and we can't really go back to that anyway, right? And he says any return now would be the fruit of an excess of corruption, which probably describes the romantic age. And so we will stagnate indefinitely in this degenerate state of war of all against all, right? We are not going to go back. It's, first of all, it's not desirable. Second, it's also impossible. So you know put the thought aside, no going back to nature, right? uh, yeah, so he says, yeah, and for the one person who wants to escape, he says, far from there being an alliance between particular interests and the general good, they exclude one another in the natural order of things. And social laws are a yoke which everyone is willing to impose on others, but not to assume himself, right? So everybody else should follow the laws. I want to escape. Libertarianism, basically. So he's like, libertarianism is nonsense, which I think any sensible person would figure it out. So where next, right? Where can we go? We can't go back to nature. Society is unbearable as it is, right? So we need some way forward. So what is Rousseau's solution? Social contract, from which you have the most famous line, man is born free and everywhere he is in chains. Yeah. Now we had social contracts from Hobbes, from Locke. So I mean, we have this notion, like otherwise as well. But what is Rousseau's social contract? So I'll focus on this because I've already run out of time. So I just want to finish. The problem, as he puts it, is to form an association that will defend and protect the person and goods of each associate with the full common force, and by means of which each, uniting with all, nevertheless obeys only himself and remains as free as possible, as before, sorry, as free as before, right? So we have to find this association that, so we are all associating, we are all together, but uh, nobody is appropriating more than the other. Nobody has more rights than the other. So that it's a common association, and we are all united, but we are also all free. How is that possible? This is the very sort of fundamental question of the time, that if we subject ourselves to a collective will, to a law of a collective, how can we be free? And this is basically the question that Rousseau is putting forward. He says that if we are not going to end in a despotism with this association, right, so we need a particular form of contract in which we contract based on equality and universal participation. And in fact, the actual contract that we are making here is that we're making a contract with ourselves in some way, with two parts of ourselves. So we as individuals free, are contracting with ourselves as part of the people, right? But we are the people itself is me. Yeah. And this is the trick. This is a solution that Rousseau proposes. He says the same individual who before the contract was an isolated being without any connection to others, right? So my only connection was master and slave, this kind of a relatedness which is, like corrupted inside. Now, if I become an indivisible part of the whole, if I see the collective as an indivisible thing of which I'm a part, right? This collective, which is called the people, then I am both a free individual and a connected people, right? And in this sense, the contract, the social contract, is the act by which a people is a people, as he says, right? So he says there's the act by which a people is a people, and this act is a formation of society, but the good society, not the bad, state of nature society, the civil society that we just sort of want to leave behind, actually. So this is the act by which a people is a people. And so humankind, mankind, he says, is a moral person having both a sentiment of common existence, which endows it with individuality and constitutes it as one, and a universal motivation which makes every part act for the sake of an end related to the whole, right? So this is the act by which a people is a people. And I know it's a bit abstract right now what we're talking about, but yeah, we can discuss this further. I know you're not reading this text, but if you have time, we can read this one as well. It's I mean, this would, I cannot even imagine, in some sense, to read the second discourse without the social contract, because they just go together. But yeah, I mean, constraints of time and how much you guys would be ready to read. So what is central to this is really, the concept of the general will. This is really important. So we talked about the will earlier, the individual will, and the will of the private person, which was capricious. It selected whatever was in the personal interest, but not always, selected well, because sometimes it selected things which it thought was in its personal interest, but might actually turn out to be bad. Why? Because I am both an individual person, but also part of a collective, right? So what is this other will that we're talking about? And this is the key, really, in Rousseau's sort of political theory, is that if the people itself is an individual in this sense, then the people has a will, right? This people is composed of several individuals who are united in this single body, who have what he says, but a single will, which is concerned with the common preservation and the general welfare, right? And this general will always tends to the good of the entire thing, right? It is not opposed to the good of any one individual, but the individual will can become factional, right? So I think, oh, I can appropriate more by forming a faction inside. Remember the faction that caused the breakdown of the previous society. So I can do better by forming a faction. And so I form a faction and I try to tend towards, the good of that faction, and that destroys the people, right? So that is what is destructive of the people. So what would be the sort of collective good of the people is something that comes from the people as a whole and tends towards the common good of everybody, right? And this collective good, he says, this collective will can be crystallized in an act of a collective called the law. And this is not the earlier law in which a faction made the law saying, oh, this is for preserving the property of the rich against the poor who might try to take it, right? Here it's not a factional law, it's a general law, right? And so this general law uh, this general will can become a law when the whole people enacts a statute for the whole people, right? So it is as general as a will that promulgates it. And let's see, if you have time, we can talk about the problems of the general will, which is also very, very interesting. But yeah, these laws uh, are what will cause the real justice, not the previous justice we were talking about, to prevail, and is a necessary condition for civil association, the good civil association. And in that sense, they are records of our will, laws in that sense, right? So I'll stop here because I've talked enough now about Rousseau, and I think I've given you enough of an introduction so that when we meet for our class, you're all ready for going in depth into the text and discussing it. And yeah, I know it's a bit longer than anticipated. You can maybe speed me up and watch it. But yeah, I hope this gives you some direction so that we can have like a good discussion when we meet. So yeah, I look forward to meeting you soon. And thank you for listening. Bye.